Hi everyone, my name is Bryan Madden. I'm the graduate assistant over the success coaches at the Tutoring and Academic Success Center, otherwise known as TASK. And today, the success coaching department presents to you reading, studying, and test-taking skills. So the three kind of important things in relation to reading skills really involves concentrating, conceptualizing, and creating. I think a lot of times with reading, we really focus on the concentrating and conceptualizing pieces. We really focus on making sure that we are actually focusing when we're reading and making sure we understand it. But I think a lot of times we skip out on the creating piece as students. So let's start with the concentrating piece. So really the concentrating piece is about being conscious, comfortable, conducive, and curious. Conscious. Instead of just autopilot reading or reading to get it done, we need to make sure when we're reading that we're actually aware of what we're reading, that we're actually aware of kind of what's going on, like what the paragraph we just read actually meant. I think a lot of times when we read, we get through a paragraph and we completely forget what it was all about. So really when we're reading, we ought to be able to ask ourselves the question after we finish a paragraph, what was that paragraph I read just about? Comfortable. A big thing that can get in the way of us concentrating is us being in an environment that really isn't comfortable for us to read in. Whether that be the chair, whether that be the temperature, whether it be that we're even hungry. We want to make sure we're reading in an environment where the book can be the focus and not our seating, not our stomach, not our level of sleep. So when we read, we ought to make sure that all of their needs are supplied and that we're in a comfortable environment. Conducive as well, that the environment that we're in actually works for us being able to read and focus on the reading. So maybe reading on our bed or reading in a room where there's a television or reading when we have other tabs on our computer open may not be the most conducive to our reading environment. Then also curious. A lot of times when we come into reading, especially if it's a chapter where we feel like we've read it before or it seems like a topic that's not going to really be helpful for us or may seem boring, a lot of times we come into it without a sense of curiosity. But when we're coming into a reading, to be able to really focus on it, we need to come in with an open mind saying, you know what, I may have these thoughts about it or these kind of experiences with it, or I may just not enjoy it, but I want to give it a shot and see what new it has to say. In addition to concentrating the content, we need to make sure that we're conceptualizing content. So really with this, the goal is all about reading for conceptualization, not completion. I think a lot of times when we're told, read chapter 6 for tonight, that our goal is not as much about making sure we understand it, but making sure that we actually read it. But really, what we should do when we're reading a textbook, we should make sure that when we're reading, our goal is to actually understand the content and not just to get a reading assignment done. Defining unknown words before moving on in the reading. This really also kind of relates back to concentrating as well. To really be able to understand the content, we need to understand the words of the content, to understand the jargon of the content, especially the jargon we've never heard before. So as we're reading the text, if we come across a word that we don't understand, rather than just guessing what it means or just thinking that it means this, what we ought to do is take some time to stop and look it up. That way, when we read it, we can read it with understanding and have proper context to what's coming next. Otherwise, that autopilot reading can also easily be had because we just missed that one word. Distinguishing main ideas from supporting details, definitely. In addition to understanding kind of what the content is, we ought to understand kind of the structure of the content, being able to understand what is the big picture here? What does the text really want me to get? And what is more so just the evidence the text is giving behind it to make sure that I get it? And then also with that, connecting the content back to previous content and to personal experiences. This can help us not just to get the content, but to understand why we're moving on to this, even though we were talking about this before, and even why this matters to me right now. Creating content. Again, as I said at the beginning, I feel like this is the piece we miss a lot. and especially when our goal is reading for completion and not for conceptualization. When we're creating content, we also engage in annotation, elaboration, congregation, and separation. Annotation. This is not just simply highlighting. This is taking notes as we're reading, taking notes in the margins, and noting kind of the main ideas, supporting details. What are the vocab words? What are the definitions of those vocab words? What are examples? Things like that. That will help us to actually grasp conceptualization, which in turn will help us be able to focus more because now we're actually getting the content and we understand the organization of it. Elaboration can kind of relate to annotation, but I like to make it a separate point because we so easily define annotation just as a process of highlighting. Elaboration really speaks to this piece of, can I put this into my own words? Or am I just saying that this is this and using the same words as the author? Because really, the only way we really know if we understand something is if we're able to explain it in a way where we can understand it. Being able to use terminology that makes sense to us and not just the same words the text used and then us not really actually knowing what it means. Congregation. This really refers to the concept of talking it through with other people. Because sometimes the way the text describes something may not be a way that we get it, but creating these meaningful discussions with others may help us to actually get it. Sometimes a student, a colleague can better explain it than maybe how the text itself explained it. And then last but not least, separation. This really kind of starts to relate into the next piece on studying, but separation is really all about being able to know, okay, I have all these notes, I have all of this elaboration, and I have all of this experience of congregation, talking with others. How am I going to separate this out into kind of a study material? How can I take what I just read and what I've discussed and what I've summarized into kind of the important treetop notes of what the content was about? Being able to separate kind of the filler from the core content. So that's the reading skills. What about the study skills? Study skills really require three things. It requires prioritizing, it requires pacing, and it requires practice. Prioritizing. So this really speaks to the piece of knowing what to study, not just actually studying, but knowing, okay, what's important enough to study? That relates to the first piece. Is the content major or is it minor? If the text were to remove this piece of content, would it lose its entire purpose and meaning? Or is it more so a minor detail that may not necessarily be as important? Is it a core piece of information, or is it an example or a supporting detail that, it's helpful to know, but it may not be essential to know? Am I confused or confident about this content? So in studying, what we really want to do is we want to prioritize more studying what we're confused on first and saving what we're confident on for kind of later, for patching in any holes of understanding. Really, the first point should be to make sure that we have cement there for the content we're not as sure about, rather than already kind of patting ourselves on the back for the content we already are confident on or know about. Was this content emphasized or minimized? This really speaks to the piece of, what did the book have to say about the content? Or what did the instructor have to say about the content? Did the book and the instructor agree that these were both pieces? Or does it seem like the book kind of has these additional pieces, but the instructor didn't necessarily cover them as much? What did the instructor specifically say? Did they say this will be on the exam or this will not be on the exam? Kind of knowing those pieces and applying it to the study materials to say, okay, I don't necessarily need to make a note card about this because the instructor didn't say that this was going to be on it, or specifically said, don't study this because it's not going to be on the test. And then lastly, with prioritizing complex content over concrete content. Complex really being about, is it a system? Is there a whole bunch of pieces of content connected together? Or is it kind of one little definition that's kind of on its own? What's important about this is kind of the fact that if it's complex, it has a bunch of working systems, it's probably more important to study just because the odds of there being more questions on it are most likely increased, especially since knowing those different pieces can help you in later questions to be able to recall and say, okay, this content goes with this, and this is how it works, so it must be this answer. Pacing. This is also one I feel like we don't think about a lot. A lot of times we think about just studying, but not as much about kind of how exactly to pace it in a comfortable manner where we're really learning and not just stuffing our brain. One thing that's really important is to make time to make study materials. So instead of just making the study materials to be last minute, making time as you're learning material to start making those materials, to start making those note cards, to start making the Quizlet, to start making the outline that you're going to use to practice rephrasing the content. With studying, the pacing of chunking is better than the pacing of cramming. So chunking really is the pacing of, I'm going to study 30 to 45 minutes a day on this content. And if I study it again, it's just going to be a 30 to 40 minute chunk. It's not going to be 5 or 10 or 3 hours altogether. It's going to be these small little chunks throughout the day, throughout the week, so that I can have little practice sessions throughout. Being conscious of content burnout, knowing when, you know what, I studied this, I know this, and I just cannot go on continuing to look at it. This is especially important when it comes to kind of the 48 hours before the exam. Knowing when, okay, I have studied this, I don't need to look at this anymore. I know this. I can say it without studying it. I just need to kind of calm down, breathe, and make sure everything else is taken care of. Which connects then to the other point of remembering your other needs. I have an exam is not an excuse to skip out on time for sleep, time for meals, time for relaxation. There needs to be a balance. And again, especially during the 48 hours before the exam. And then last but not least with studying, practice. Studying by test type and test environment. Test type really speaks to, is it multiple choice? Is it extended response? Is it an essay? Is it practical math problems where I have to solve with equations? Being able to study in the same type of test can really help to make sure that the studying is actually applicable. Because it wouldn't make sense to study for an essay exam by doing multiple choice questions. And the same as vice versa. You wouldn't want to study for a kind of multiple choice exam by writing out an essay. Test environment, studying in test environment as well. A lot of research has shown that by studying in a similar environment that you learn the content in, it's easier to recall the information and actually helps to perform better on the test. So if you learn the content in a loud room with a lot of people, it may be easier to study in that same environment and easier to recall it than, say, if you were to study in a quiet room with no one else there. Practicing over peaking. Some of us, when we study just by reading notes over and over again. But truly, that's not really congruent with what a test is. A test is not just reading. A test is not just reading notes. So what we should do when we study is we ought to make sure it's some type of practice with the content. It's some type of kind of working at it, being able to be right or wrong about the content and kind of revising and kind of looking through it and working with it rather than just reading it over and over and over again. There ought to be something like note cards, Quizlet, practicing writing it out, practice problems, anything like that where we're actually practicing content and not just looking at it. Kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, 2 heads are better than 1. Taking time to collaborate with other students to study the material. Zoom study sessions can be a great way for us to practice with one another. Or maybe we aren't comfortable with that. One thing I have found really effective sometimes with studying is even studying with those who are in my house. Yeah, sure, they may not be in the class, but that gives me an opportunity to explain the content to them and then see if I was right about it. And then what's also really important is repetition and rephrasing. So being able to practice it over and over, again, still keeping in mind that these are 30 to 45-minute practice sessions and not not like 3 to 5 hour session long sessions. And then rephrasing, being able to put the content into our own words rather than just over and over again, just stating what we already know is on like in the notes or in the readings or what we wrote on the note card. And lastly, we have test taking skills. So really test taking skills is all about the mind, the method, and the motion. The mind. What's so funny about studying and about test taking is a lot of times we put such a focus on the mind. But truth of the matter is the mind can be a place of both help and hindrance for us during an exam. A confident mind that can give kind of positive self-talk and can remind oneself, okay, I have studied this, will help. But a mind that has overstudied, a mind that can only say, you know what, this exam is going to not be great, or a mind that just gets worried about performance is really going to become a hindrance to us doing well. But there are some things we can do to prevent this from happening. So when we get to the exam, or even on the day of the exam, don't study and don't talk to classmates while you wait for the exam. Don't study because if you study in that last minute, it may be a point of overthinking of, oh, well, I just studied this note card and I thought it said this, but when I studied it earlier, I thought it said this, and it can lead to a whole bunch of confusion as you're taking the exam. Also, not talking to classmates because classmates are probably just as worried or think the exam is just going to be as bad as we do. And that disencouragement we really don't need because that's going to make us feel even worse. Focus on the fact that you studied, not on what you may have missed. Being able to say to yourself, you know what, I may not have studied this long. I may not have put in this much, but you know what, I did study this, I did study this, I did study this, and I studied for this long on these days. So I know I can at least get this portion of the content right. And when we get to the content I don't know, we'll get to it. And then again, challenging any thoughts of failure with evidence of studying. Saying, you know what, even though I may right now be thinking that I'm not going to do great, I know I studied for this long. I know I studied this content. And I know that even though there are parts where I got it wrong, there were some pretty good successes as I studied that content. The method. So during taking the exam, a couple things that you can do. Focus on narrowing answers, not finding answers. Especially with multiple choice, sometimes we get so caught up with finding the right answer that we end up kind of making it harder for ourselves. Truth of the matter is, by starting with the answers that are wrong and not focusing so much on which answer is right, we make it more likely that we can get the answer correct. Thinking about it in stats, having just one answer eliminated gives you a 1 in 3 chance rather than a 1 in 4 chance. And that raises it from 25% of getting it right to 33.3 repeating percent of getting it right. By focusing more on which answer is wrong and not which answer is right, we give ourselves a better chance that we can pick the right answer. And a way to start being able to figure out what answer is right or what answer is wrong is by highlighting important aspects of the question and also of the answers themselves as well. Being able to distinguish, okay, this question is asking about this, so I know it's not this answer because this answer went with this chapter and did not go with the chapter that this concept was from. Being able to highlight words like not or except or all of these but, kind of those pieces as well. Reference previous questions for current questions. A lot of times, the ways that instructors will write questions, sometimes questions from previous parts of the exam can help with current questions, especially if we were eliminating the answers before. We can be like looking back and say, okay, I eliminated this answer here because I knew it was about this. And now I'm on this question, and it is about that same thing that I eliminated that previous question about. So you know what, maybe it's this answer. Taking notes on your exam if possible. This can be a great way to have physical distinctions of, okay, this is the wrong answer, or this is the right answer because this. Sometimes what I even like to do, I like to write the rationale of why I'm picking an answer right next to the answer that I pick, so that I can know, okay, if I'm looking back through these questions later to check to make sure I did everything, I can know, okay, I picked this answer because of this reason, not just because of some unrelated reason. And then lastly, answering every question. A lot of times students will just not answer every question. And the the kind of issue with that is the fact that point 0.1 points is still more points than 0 points. So just make some type of attempt. Even if you're wrong, at least there was the attempt. At least there was the possibility that you could have gotten a question right. Yeah, sure, a 25% chance is scary to take the chance on, but a 0% chance is just guaranteed that you won't get the answer correct. This is especially noticeable with essay questions. A lot of times students will just skip essay questions and not do them. But just writing something has a better chance of getting points than writing nothing. And then last but not least, the motion. So take the exam at your pace, not the pace of others. Exam success is not based on speed. It's not a race. Some students are just getting it done fast so they can get out of here because they already know they're going to bomb. So taking the exam at your pace and not letting the pace of others influence whether or not you should speed up or slow down. Skipping questions you cannot easily answer and come back later. The exam is not necessarily required that you take it in order, depending on the test, but in most cases, you don't have to answer the questions in the exact order they're written in. So in coming across a question you don't answer, rather than spending so much time on it, taking time to say, you know what, I don't know this answer. I'm going to come back to it later. And sometimes what I like to do is putting a star next to it so I know, okay, I'm going to look back through this exam later, making sure I answered everything. And I see this star here, so I must not have answered it. Reference the clock, but don't focus on it. So it's important for us to be mindful of our time being used in an exam, but at the same time, we can't be so focused on it that we end up kind of becoming anxious. So really being able to say, I have this much time left. I need to kind of separate it out this way, but I'm not going to focus on the clock to the point where I can't get these questions done. And then last but not least, taking breathing breaks. It's important for us to kind of take times to, after we finish a bunch of questions, take a step back, breathe, and then come back in. I especially like to do this if I have kind of gone through all the questions and now I'm rechecking. That way I can kind of have a little bit of a refreshed mindset coming into it. So if you liked what you saw today and you feel these things could be very useful, success coaching is definitely for you. Success coaching provides one-on-one coaching in a multitude of academic success areas, whether that be time management, whether that be note taking, whether that be test taking, whether that be goal setting, whatever it is. Although it is general academic skills rather than specific courses, what coaches really try to do, they try to make sure that what you're doing works for you and works for the classes you're in. And the sessions are based around the needs of you as the student. So let's say you come in, you don't like Cornell notes. They're not going to make you do Cornell notes. Sure, they may introduce it to you, but if you don't like it, they're not going to force you to do it. I think that's what's really helpful about it, in my experience with it. You can register for a session through Starfish, but if you can't figure out how to do it through Starfish, you can also email task at tutoring@csuohio.edu or call us at 216-687-2012. Just keep in mind that all sessions are 1 hour in length and all sessions are held online via Zoom. Here's how to sign up for Starfish. Again, you can call the number or you can email as well. I'll leave this up here for a couple seconds so that maybe if you want to pause the video and take a picture, you can do so. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I hope to see you in success coaching. I hope your exams go well.